World War II wasn't born in a storm of chaos and explosions. It was conceived in quiet moments, in rooms where decisions were put off, and in fearful minds that chose the illusion of safety over the weight of responsibility. The war didn't truly start with a declaration or a gunshot. It started when silence took the place of action, and when fear replaced courage. After the Great War, the world was utterly exhausted. Nations were shattered, economies were in ruins, and millions were left traumatized. The leaders promised, never again, and the people desperately wanted to believe them. This powerful desire for peace, this collective trauma, ironically became the very foundation for one of the greatest failures in modern history. Fear shaped every decision that followed. Governments were terrified of public backlash. Politicians were petrified of economic collapse. Entire societies feared the idea of sacrifice. The haunting memories of trench warfare, poison gas, and mass graves loomed over a whole generation. Because of this, confrontation became unthinkable, even when the danger was staring them right in the face. Germany, meanwhile, emerged from the First War humiliated and deeply unstable. The Treaty of Versailles had stripped the nation of its power, its land, and its dignity. Instead of fostering an environment for rebuilding trust, it planted seeds of resentment. Millions were left unemployed, hungry, and angry. This toxic environment didn't create evil out of thin air, but it certainly allowed it to grow and fester. Adolf Hitler never hid his intentions. His speeches were aggressive, his ideology was violent, and his goals were openly expansionist. Yet the world listened without truly reacting. Leaders told themselves his words were just bluster, just for show, or a temporary phase. Silence became a form of collective denial. Fear made the policy of appeasement seem like a reasonable, even wise, choice. When Germany tore up treaties and began to rebuild its military, the international response was pathetically weak. Each blatant violation was explained away as an understandable reaction to past grievances. Every act of aggression was met not with resistance, but with more negotiation. The remilitarization of the Rhineland should have been the final straw. It was a direct, brazen challenge to the post-war international order. Instead, the world did nothing. That silence sent a message louder and clearer than any speech. The rules no longer applied. The fear of another war had become greater than the fear of tyranny itself. Leaders clung to the naive belief that giving concessions would prevent a conflict, that a dictator could somehow be satisfied. This belief ignored history, it ignored psychology, and it ignored the grim reality unfolding before them. Austria was then absorbed without a single shot fired. Czechoslovakia was sacrificed on the altar of peace for our time. Entire nations and their borders were erased while the world just watched. Silence became official policy. Fear became a grand strategy. International institutions like the League of Nations proved utterly useless because they were built on the idea of agreement, not enforcement. They could issue warnings, but there were never any real consequences. At the very same time, the global economy was collapsing. The Great Depression consumed everyone's attention. National survival replaced international vigilance. Governments turned inward, focusing on domestic problems, while the threats on the horizon grew larger and more menacing. In Asia, Japan was expanding violently across China. In Africa, Italy invaded Ethiopia, but the world treated them like distant problems, someone else's trouble. Once again, silence replaced action. Entire populations were systematically conditioned to accept, and even cheer for, violence. The world drastically underestimated how quickly lies could replace reality. Behind closed doors, secret agreements were signed. Trust between nations completely collapsed, and diplomacy became a hollow performance. The infamous Nazi-Soviet pact removed the final barrier to a full-scale European war. Fear of each other led former rivals to betray the world. When Germany finally invaded Poland, the silence was shattered by the sounds of war. But by then, it was far too late. The machinery of destruction had been built, tested, and perfected over years. All those years of fear had only served to strengthen those who thrived on violence. World War II was not inevitable. It was allowed. It was created by hesitation, by a desperate fear of responsibility, and by a deafening silence when voices of courage should have risen up. The greatest lesson of this devastating war isn't found in the epic battles. In our last video, we explored how the seeds of fear were planted after World War I. Now, we'll see how that fear blossomed into a policy of silence, directly paving the way for the Second World War. As aggression went unchecked, fear stopped being a momentary reaction and became a habit. Each time the world backed down from a confrontation, it made it easier to back down the next time. Silence wasn't just a response anymore, it became a strategy. Leaders became experts at justifying inaction, and entire societies learned to accept it. This policy had a name: appeasement. It was sold to the public as wisdom, and concessions were framed as brilliant diplomacy. But in reality, they were a complete withdrawal from responsibility. Every deal struck with the dictators only reinforced their belief that fear was their opponent's true ruler. Their confidence swelled in the absence of any real resistance. The Munich Agreement stands as the most infamous symbol of this catastrophic failure. A sovereign nation, Czechoslovakia, was essentially dismantled and handed over without its consent, all in the name of peace. Leaders returned home to cheering crowds, celebrating a peace built not on safety, but on the sacrifice of others. Silence was hailed as a grand success, while the profound betrayal was hidden behind eloquent speeches and handshakes. While the politicians celebrated, military readiness crumbled. Believing peace was secured, defense budgets were slashed, troop training slowed down, and military innovation ground to a halt. Nations placed their faith in paper agreements instead of actual preparedness. This created a dangerous illusion of safety, leaving them incredibly vulnerable when the time for action finally, inevitably, arrived. This fear wasn't just confined to the halls of power. It seeped into the public consciousness. Citizens who dared to question the policy of appeasement were often shouted down, dismissed as warmongers trying to drag everyone into another devastating conflict. Protesting against inaction became deeply unpopular. The collective trauma of the Great War was so strong that no one wanted to be the one to break the fragile peace. So, silence spread, not just through government decrees, but through immense social pressure. The media also played a role, often softening the harsh realities of the time. Aggressive invasions were reported with a strange lack of urgency, and horrific atrocities were described with neutral words like conflicts. This constant dilution of language and truth created a false sense of normalcy. When everything is made to sound ordinary, nothing feels alarming enough to act upon. Meanwhile, the dictators were watching. They were studying these reactions with meticulous care. They learned that bold lies, repeated often enough, were incredibly powerful tools of manipulation. Most importantly, they learned that the world was terrified of discomfort, and would do almost anything to avoid it. The League of Nations, the one institution designed to prevent such a crisis, collapsed under the weight of its own impotence. It could issue condemnations, but it couldn't act. It had no army, no real power to enforce its decisions. Then came the Nazi-Soviet Pact, a stunning alliance between two ideological enemies that shocked the world. But this pact revealed a deeper, more troubling truth. When fear becomes the dominant force, survival overrides everything, even core beliefs. It showed that when trust completely disintegrates on the world stage, chaos is the only possible outcome. The invasion of Poland was the final, brutal expose of the true cost of silence. Blitzkrieg, the lightning war, overwhelmed Polish defenses with terrifying speed and efficiency. Civilians bore the immediate brunt of the attack. Cities burned as the hollow promises of peace turned to ash overnight. Declarations of war did finally come, but it was too late. The crucial momentum was lost. The window of opportunity to prevent a global conflict, to stop the aggression when it was still manageable, had long since passed. What remained was a desperate attempt at damage control, not prevention. Together, they had meticulously built the perfect conditions for a global catastrophe. By the time the world finally found its voice and decided to shout no more, the cries were drowned out by the thunder of bombs. Every new battlefront, every fallen city, was a tragic reminder that decisive early action could have saved countless people. As the war spread, the illusion of safety vanished completely. Nations that once believed distance would protect them found themselves drawn into the conflict. Silence had failed as a shield, and fear had failed as a strategy. The world now faced the consequences of years of hesitation. Cities became targets, and civilians became victims. Bombs fell not only on military bases, but on homes, schools, and hospitals. Ordinary people paid the price for decisions they never made. Total war erased the line between the battlefield and daily life. Occupied countries lived under constant terror. Freedom disappeared quietly, replaced by control, surveillance, and punishment. Resistance movements formed in secret, risking execution for the hope of dignity. Courage emerged where fear had once dominated. The Holocaust revealed the darkest cost of global silence. Long before liberation, stories of persecution were known. Refugees warned governments, reports described brutality, and yet borders remained closed. Fear of involvement outweighed the duty to protect life. Silence became complicity. Entire communities were erased while the world debated responses. Bureaucracy delayed rescue. Disbelief replaced urgency. The genocide was not hidden. It was ignored. This truth remains one of history's greatest moral failures. In Asia, the suffering mirrored Europe. Japan's expansion brought destruction across China and the Pacific. Civilians endured massacres, forced labor, and starvation. Fear ruled through violence, and silence allowed it to continue. Only when survival itself was threatened did full resistance emerge. Nations mobilized industries, economies, and populations. Sacrifice became unavoidable. The cost of delayed courage was measured in millions of lives. Alliances formed not from trust, but from necessity. Former rivals united against a shared threat. Cooperation succeeded where isolation failed. The world learned painfully that collective action was the only answer to collective danger. As battles turned and aggressors were pushed back, reflection began. Leaders recognized that early resistance would have prevented unimaginable suffering. World War II forced humanity to confront an uncomfortable truth. Evil does not always arrive loudly. Fear silences warnings. Silence empowers aggression. Together they create disasters that appear sudden but are built slowly over time. The war was not only a military conflict, it was a moral reckoning. It exposed the danger of hesitation when values are threatened. The greatest destruction came not from the first attack but from the years before it, when action was possible and courage was postponed. This history reminds us that the fight for peace is not won through silence or fear. When the war finally spread across continents, the world understood the price of hesitation. The conflict was no longer distant or political. It was personal, immediate, and unavoidable. Silence had ended, but fear remained, and now it had teeth. Cities became targets, and civilians were no longer protected by distance. Air raids erased neighborhoods overnight. Occupation revealed the darkest side of unchecked power. As entire populations lived under surveillance, hunger, and terror. The Holocaust emerged from years of ignored warnings. Persecution was visible long before the extermination camps were revealed. Refugees told their stories, but borders closed anyway. The genocide wasn't hidden, it was dismissed, delayed, and doubted. Silence allowed the machinery of death to operate efficiently. As the war neared its end, the world faced ruins, not relief. World War II forced humanity to confront a truth. Evil advances most easily when it is underestimated.